The plow hit the third row of standing silk rye at first light, and the screaming at the fence line started before the second row fell. Sefindral stood with his double thumbs hooked over the top rail of the boundary fence, dust lids half down against the chaff, and watched a human woman destroy the only thing on Hewell that had ever made her family money. At the far end of the bottomland, on a graywood pylon driven in at an angle nobody had asked about, the old green lens was still burning from the night before, a fat ring of laminated glass the size of a cartwheel, glowing like a patient eye while the sun came up behind it. She had not even waited for the harvest crews. That was the part Dasso Krell kept howling about. 2 fence posts down, his collar vents flared so wide Sefin could hear them whistle. The silkery was 11 days from cutting, 11 days. 5 years of root laying, 3 years of first-grade harvests, a crop that traded at 41 credits the bale on the orbital exchange and could not be replanted in under half a decade. And Wren Calloway was driving her father's plow straight through the middle of it in long, flat, deliberate passes, turning the most valuable rootstock in the Brace Valley into mulch. "You answer me," Krell bellowed. He had both fists on the rail now, hammering it in rhythm. "You answer this fence, Calloway. That's export grade. That's the valley's name on the exchange. You answer." She did not answer. She reached the headland, turned the plow with the easy little shoulder check her father used to make, and came back down the next rows with the share set deeper. Sefin had known Wren Calloway for 19 seasons, which was his whole life less 3. He had eaten at the Calloway table when fen fever took her mother, and the neighbors carried food until the family could stand to cook again. He had hauled stone with her, traded seed feed labor with her, lost 4 straight arm wrestles to her at the Equinox Fair and called it a draw out of dignity. He could count on one hand, thumbs included, the number of times he had seen her do anything without arithmetic behind it. There was no arithmetic behind this. He had run it every way a Teles could run it, and Teles could run arithmetic in their sleep. 38 hectares of bottomland, the only flat kilometer in the valley that didn't flood in the green months, plowed under at the peak of its yield, for a landing field. For ships that every relay, every shipping factor, every official voice from here to the trade spine had pronounced dead 11 years ago. "She's sun-touched," Krell said, dropping off the rail at last, breathing hard. He said it to Sefin because Sefin was nearest and because everyone in Crossfin knew the draws worked. "Trade with the Calloway plot. You hear me, boy? Grief does it. Took her mother, took her gran, and now it's taken her. Somebody's got to get a magistrate's hold on that land before she beggars herself." "Her gran isn't dead," Sefin said. "Her gran is 11 years dark," Krell said. "That's deeder than dead. Dead with a stamp on it." He spat chaff and walked off down the fence line to scream at someone who'd argue back. By mid-morning, there were upward of 30 colonists strung along the boundary, humans and Telesk both, 2 Vray traders who'd come out from the depot just to look, and a row of children sitting on the rail like fence swallows, thrilled by the noise. Wren plowed. When the plow needed fuel, she fueled it. When old Marston called her a vandal of her own blood's work, she nodded to him, polite as you like, the way you'd nod to a man who had remarked on the weather and got back up on the seat. Sefin went over the fence at noon. He told himself it was to talk sense into her. He carried the water jug as an excuse, because among Telesk you did not interrupt a fool's work without bringing something, even if the work was foolishness itself. She shut the plow down when she saw him coming, which was more than she'd done for anyone else all morning. Up close, the ruin was worse. Silkery root, pale and fat as a forearm, lay sliced and glistening in the turned rows. The smell of it, green, sweet, oily, sat on the field like a reproach. 5 years of patient feeding opened up to the sun in a single morning. "Sefin," she said. She took the jug, drank, and handed it back. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were the same brown they had always been, not fevered, not glassy, just set. And that frightened him more than raving would have. Madness he could have argued with. "Wren," he said, "your harvest was 11 days out. I know the date. 41 a bale. Krell's been shouting your gross at the whole fence all morning. He's not far wrong on the number." "He's 2 credits high," she said. Exchange dipped at the last fix. She wiped her neck and looked down the length of the bottomland, and Sefin saw her see something that was not there, or not there yet, laid over the wreck of her crop, the way his father could look at a bare slope in thaw and see the tuber rows that would stand on it by midsummer. 1,000 meters, she said. 60 wide, packed and crowned, so it sheds rain, with clear approaches at both ends. That's what it has to be, and there's nowhere else in the valley it can be. You know there isn't. It's this ground or no ground. "For the lift," Sefin said. Saying it out loud felt like handling something that might go off. "For the lift, Wren." He kept his voice low, the way you'd talk near a skittish animal, and hated himself for it. "The lift is gone. The relay chain went dark when we were children. There hasn't been a hail, a beacon, a debris ping, anything in 11 years. Every soul who is paid to know says those ships are dead. They're slow, Ren said, not lost. She said it the way other people said the sun's rise in the east. Then she climbed back onto the plow, and that was the end of the conversation. Because what do you say to the sun's rising? That night, like every night for the past 200 and some nights, the green lens burned at the edge of the bottomland, and half the valley could see it from their porches, and Sephindral lay awake in his bunk doing arithmetic that would not come out. The lens had arrived 3 years ago before any of this, in a crate with Earth shipping marks so old the ink had gone brown. Sephin had helped her uncrate it. Back when it was just a curiosity, a ring of green laminated glass, 70 centimeters across, cast in stepped concentric ridges that threw the light of a single cell into a beam you could read by at a kilometer. Pre-collapse work. Approach light glass from a coastal airfield on Earth, salvaged when they tore the field up, packed and shipped ahead by Etta Calloway, with 2 lines in her own hand on the lid, for the bottom field. You'll know when. There was a chip on the outer ring, a clean crescent the size of a thumbnail, like a bite taken out of a coin. Ren ran her finger around it every time she cleaned the glass. Sephin had asked her once what the chip was. She'd said she didn't know, and that her grand did, and that she intended to ask her. Intended, present tense. About a woman 11 years silent on a ship the whole galaxy had buried. He went back over the fence the next day and the day after that. He told his mother it was to keep an eye on a neighbor who had lost her balance, which was almost true the first day and a lie by the third. What it was by the third day was this. He could not watch someone move that much earth alone. She worked like the field had insulted her. Up before either sun, the plow, then the drag harrow, then the stone sled. The bottomland had been picked clean of stone for crops a generation ago, but a crop only needs the top of the ground honest. A landing run needed the body of it honest, a meter down, and the body of the Brace Valley was full of old river, cobbles the size of sleeping dogs. She pulled them with the winch, with the lever bar, with her hands. Sephin started on the far end with his own bar without asking, because asking would have made it a thing, and they worked toward each other for 6 hours and met in the middle at dusk, and she looked at him across the last cobble and said, "You think I'm sun-touched?" "Yes," Sephin said, "but you're here." "The stone doesn't care why," he said, and heaved it onto the sled. She laughed. One short breath of it, the first he'd heard from her since the plowing, and they dragged the sled in together under a sky going the color of cooling iron, and behind them the lens came on, dusk to dawn, the way a heartbeat doesn't ask permission. The trouble with the lean arrived on the 9th day, riding in the inside pocket of Factor Imla Bex. Bex was Vray, narrow as a fence slat, gray-mottled, with the long, careful face of a being who had spent 60 years saying unwelcome numbers to farmers, and had learned to say them gently. The co-op had advanced the Calloway plot against the standing crop. Everyone borrowed against the standing crop. That was what the green months were for. And the standing crop was now 1,100 tons of plowed-in mulch, with a fence full of witnesses. Sephin was close enough to hear it, because he was the one who had hauled the water that hour. Beck stood at the edge of the torn field with the wind pulling at the hem of the Factor's coat and said, "Ren, you know why I've come." "I do." Ren said, "Call it. Don't make me call it." "I plowed your collateral, Imla. You don't have a choice. Call it." Bex looked down the bottomland. At the kilometer of turned earth, already losing the shape of a farm and finding the shape of something else, and at the pylon at the far end with its dead green eye waiting for sundown. 6,140, the Factor said. Plus the season's advance on fuel and parts, 61 days. After that, the board can move on the land itself, and they will, because half of them have wanted bottomland frontage their whole lives, and you have just handed them a reason. The Factor's voice stayed gentle the whole way through, which somehow made it worse. "I argued for 90 days. I lost. I want that known." "It's known," Ren said. "Thank you for the 90. I didn't get the 90. Thank you for arguing." Bex's mouth worked the way Vray mouths did when arithmetic and sentiment jammed in the same gear. "What do I tell the board? Ren, give me a sentence I can carry. Anything. Tell me there's a contract behind this. A freight tender, a government instrument. Anyone at all who has promised you one single credit will land on that ground." "Nobody's promised me anything," Ren said. "Tell the board the field will be finished before their deadline, and lit, and that they're welcome at the opening." That sentence crossed Crossfin by supper time the way only a perfectly mad sentence can. "They're welcome at the opening." Sephin heard it retold at the depot in 3 voices before he got his hauler loaded, once as comedy, once as scandal, and once from old Peladuba, who had run the colony's only road grader for 30 years and had hands like split gray wood, with something underneath it that was not comedy at all. 11 days from cutting, a depot man was saying, shaking his head. "Burned 40,000 standing on the ground for ships 11 years dead." "They surveyed that valley for the lift, you know," Pell said, to no one in particular, in the voice of a woman checking a level. "Before any of you were freight, Corridor comes right down the brace. There was supposed to be a field. Nobody picked it up. She didn't push it. She caught Sefin looking at her and held his eyes one beat too long, like she'd left something on the counter for him and would not be saying what. He asked his father that night. Essex Drawl kept hives and opinions and was generous with one of them. Before your time, Essex said, working a frame loose, voice mild under the veil. Hewell got its charter cheap because we sat under a surveyed corridor. The ladder lift was to come slow from old Earth, generation style, and waypoint worlds were to lay long-run fields for the ferries, so the arcs would never have to break deep into a well they couldn't climb out of. Crossfin took the charter discount. Then the relays went dark, and the field came up at the board, and it was let quietly die. The discount, you'll notice, nobody offered back. He slid the frame home. Your mother voted to let it die. So did everyone. Dead ships need no runway. It was good arithmetic. Was it wrong? It was arithmetic, Essex said. Arithmetic is never wrong. It's just never the whole field. He looked out at the far green point burning steady across the valley dark. The Calloway woman kept the grandmother's band gear, didn't she? The big antenna her father put up. It came down in the year of the 2 storms, Sefin said. Wren rebuilt it smaller. She listens on the old corridor band at night. Krell says that proves the sun touch. Krell, said his father, has never in his life waited for anything he could not see from his porch. And that was all the opinion he would give. It would have stayed a private madness. One woman, one field, one lender's clock, except that Crossfin could see the lens. That was the thing about a beacon Sefin came to understand, watching the valley take sides those first weeks. A private faith can be ignored. A light cannot. It came on at dusk and it said, every dusk, plainly in a color no one else in the brace had a use for, I am still expecting them. And every porch in the valley had to look at it and decide every single night what they thought about that. And most of them decided to be furious because the alternative was to wonder. The children defected first. Children always do. By the 3rd week, there were 4 of them hauling stone after lessons, 2 human kids from the mill houses and a pair of Telesk hatchlings, including Iddy Moore, who was 7, missed every other word you said to her, and would have walked into a thresher for Wren Calloway, because Wren let her switch the lens on at dusk. There is no force on any settled world like a 7-year-old with a job. Iddy threw the contact lever each evening with both hands and the gravity of a magistrate sealing a treaty, and the green beam stood up across the valley, and somewhere on 30 porches, 30 adults ground their teeth at it. Krell organized the petition in the 4th week. Sefin's brother Moke signed it at the depot counter where everyone could see him sign. Public nuisance and waste of chartered agricultural land, it said, and it gathered 91 names in 6 days, and Sefin's mother read it at the board table without her face moving at all, which is how Vora Drawl read everything from weather reports to death notices. His mother summoned him. There was no other word for the way she did it. On a 5th-day evening, to the seat across her work table, where colony business got decided before the board ever saw it. The petition lay between them, squared to the table edge. You are on her land 6 days and 7, Vora said. Our plot slack until thaw end. I trade the labor forward. Stannis fee law, same as father traded to the mill. Don't recite fee law at me. I sat the fee law committee before you hatched. She turned the petition a quarter, so the names faced him. 91. By vote season, it will be twice that. The board will be asked to act on the lien when it lapses, and the board will act, because the lien is real, the debt is real, and the waste, she touched the petition once, is real and visible from every window in this valley. When that day comes, my son will not be standing in the middle of that field. Is that understood? Sefin looked at his mother's hand on the paper. Telesk learned their parents' hands before their faces. The hands do the real talking. Hers were flat, calm, certain. He thought of Wren's hands on the jug, steady that first day in the ruined silkery. 2 kinds of certainty, and a fence between them and him on it. She says they're slow, he heard himself say. Not lost. 11 years, Sefin. It's a long way, he said, to come on no engine worth the name. Slow isn't lost. Vora Drawl studied her middle son for a long moment, vents drawn down to slits, and what was in her face was worse than anger. It was sorrow, the particular sorrow of a careful being watching contagion reach her own house. That woman's grandmother, she said quietly, made the whole of that family a promise no one alive can keep. I won't watch her spend you on it too, off that land by vote season. That is the last time I say it as your mother. The next time I am the board. He went out into the dark, across the valley, green and steady and small with distance. The lens was saying the thing it said every night to everyone. He was back over the fence at dawn. She told him about the message in the 5th week, on the night the harvester sold. The Vanek brothers came for it at dusk with their low loader and their careful faces, the way you come to buy a dead man's boots. The Calloway harvester was the best machine in the South Valley, and everyone knew it, and everyone knew what it meant that it was going, 11 days after it should have been swimming in Silkery. Ren walked the brothers around it, named every fault it had honestly, took 200 less than she could have squeezed, and stood in the yard while they chained it down, and hauled her father's pride away up the depot road. Then she went to the shed, took up the lever bar, and started on the pump house roof. "Tin's worth 90 a sheet at the depot," she said, when Stefan just stood there. Pump house can wear thatch. Grab the far edge. They stripped the roof in the dark by hand lamp and stacked the sheets, and when they were done, she sat down on the stack with her forearms on her knees, and for the first time since the plowing, she looked tired in a way that water didn't fix. The lens stood green over the field. The field itself had stopped looking like a wound. The grade was running true down the center line now, 1,000 meters of crowned earth wanting stone and packing, and it had cost her so far by Stefan's private ledger. One harvest, one harvester, one roof, the irrigation shares her mother had left her. Krell had bought those at the waterboard sale and had made sure the whole depot saw him do it, and the standing respect of every adult in the Brace Valley, but possibly two. "You've never once asked me why I'm sure," she said. "I asked the first day. You said they're slow, not lost. I took that as the whole answer. It's most of it." She turned her head, and the green of the lens sat in her eyes. 11 years back, the night the relays went dark. Everyone remembers it as the night the lift died. Same night, both suns down, my grand's antenna out back screaming wind. My father got me out of bed. He'd been up every night that month on the corridor band, ever since the relay chain started dropping segments. They knew it was failing Stefan. The Relay Corporation had stopped maintenance 2 years before, written the contract down to nothing because the lift was slow freight, and slow freight doesn't sue. The chain didn't die of mystery. It died of a budget line. Stefan said nothing. "Among Telesk, you do not step on a story that is finally walking." One message came down that night, Ren said. Lock time just before the last segment quit. It was Gran's voice. "You have to understand what it cost to send it." They were rationing transmitter power. Even then, the arcs ran on nothing. Every watt was argued over. She spent her whole personal allowance, years of it, on 14 seconds. Ren looked at the lens and recited it the way you recite a thing that has been recited every night of a childhood. Yarrow Group to Hewell Relay. "We are slow, not lost. 3 fairies live. Field and light on the old corridor bird, and we will find you." End. The night insects ticked. Far off, a herd animal of Krell's complained about something the way they did. "Bird," Stefan said. "She called me that before I could walk." Ren stood up off the tin and stretched her back until it cracked. Every official channel called the silence proof of death. My father went to the board with the recording, and the board sent it up to the shipping factors, and the factors sent back a finding. Her voice didn't change when she said it, which was how Stefan knew the words were burned in. Final transmission consistent with terminal drift. No basis for waypoint obligations. "Slow freight doesn't sue," she said again. "My father appealed it every year until the fever season took him." Gran's message bought 14 seconds, and the findings spent them in 9 words. She picked up the hand lamp. "So no, nobody's promised me a credit will ever land on this ground. But I was promised a light would be looked for. I'd rather be the fool who lit it than the heir who didn't." She walked the lamp up the line of the grade, checking the night stakes, and Stefan stood by the cooling tin and understood, with the sensation of a key going over in a lock, that he had been wrong about one thing from the very first morning. This was not the absence of arithmetic. It was a different equation than the colony's. With one variable, the colony had set to 0 and Ren Calloway had not, and no living being on Hewell had the data to say whose figure was right. 11 years dark. Slow, not lost. Both of those could still be true on the same night sky. He went home and did not sleep, and over the porch rail the green light burned, saying what it said. The ferries were the part the depot men could never get past, when the whole matter came up over fuel and way bills, which it did now daily. Even grant her the arcs, the elder Vanek said, holding court by the scale house with the patience of a man who had bought a good harvester cheap and could afford generosity. Grant the whole fairy tale, 3 arcs crawling in dark, slow, alive. Arcs don't land, friend. Arcs can't land. They were built in orbit, and they'll die in orbit. So she's built her field for what? For fairies older than the collapse, dropping blind on a world with no grid, no tower, no approach control, but a farm girl with a salvaged light? He let the laugh come up the way a fisherman lets out line. "I've seen the light. Pretty color. You know what answers a pretty green light in the dark, in my experience? Moths." It got the laugh it was built for. It always did. The depot had a slate that season. Stefan saw it behind the scale house counter with his own eyes, taking wagers on the first thing to touch down on. Callaway Strip. Dust Devil was the short odds favorite. Krell's herd escaped was second. Somebody had written the lift itself at 500 to 1, and somebody else had crossed out the number and written taken. I more, because even a 7-year-old's wage credit spend, and the depot found that funnier than anything. Safin asked Peladuba about the ferries, because by then, Pel was on the field every third day with the colony's road grader, and the board had not yet found the nerve to ask her why. She had shown up in the 6th week, unannounced, the big machine rolling down the bottomland lane at dawn like weather. She'd set the blade without a word of greeting and said only to Wren across the morning, "A field wants a crown. You don't crown a kilometer with a stone sled, child. Move your stakes." And that was Pel, hired on at the wage of nothing. And the work jumped forward a month and 10 days. "Ferries," Pel said now, walking the fresh grade at shift's end, boots testing the pack. Vanek the younger asked me the same, all smirk. I told him what I'll tell you. I was 17 when the survey crews came through and staked this corridor. And I carried the chain for the woman who did the figuring, and I have forgotten more about lift ferries than that depot will ever know between them. She stopped, toed a soft spot, marked it with a flag from her belt without breaking stride. Lift ferries are the simplest landing machines ever sent out of Earth's yards, on purpose. No grid seekers, there'd be no grids where they were going, no tower handshake. They drop on inertials and eyes, and their eyes, she said nodding up the field at the pylon, were built to one standard. Pre-collapse approach optics, stepped lens, fixed spectrum, that green and no other green, because that frequency carries through dust and rain haze and a dirty atmosphere better than any other line in the band. You could light a bonfire the size of this valley and a ferry would ignore it as ground clutter. You show it that lens at a kilometer of flat, and an autopilot older than my mother will put its skids inside 10 meters of the center line, every time, forever. They built them to find exactly one thing in the dark. She looked at the light a moment longer than she needed to. The girl isn't keeping a memorial, whatever this valley thinks. She's keeping half a machine. The other half either died 11 years ago or it didn't, and nobody on this world knows which. That's the whole of it. Everything else is porch talk. My mother says the promise can't be kept by anyone alive, Sefin said. Your mother, Pel said without heat, voted with everyone else to bury the field the first time. Smart woman, good arithmetic. But nobody who helped bury a promise gets to be the judge of whether it can be kept. She swung up into the grader cab, old joints careful, and paused with her hand on the lever. 61 days the factor gave her. We'll have pack and crown in 40 if the sky holds. Lights and aprons after. It'll be close, but the field will stand before the board can vote. She fired the engine and said, mostly to the field, almost lost under the noise. It should have stood 20 years ago. The sky did not hold. Bex came out first, 3 days ahead of it, which Sefin only understood afterward. The factor stood at the field edge in the flat yellow light of a wrong-feeling afternoon and gave Wren, new straight, gentle as ever. The board had not waited for the lean to lapse after all. A motion was drafted. Fallow misuse of chartered agricultural land, an old clause written for absentees and drunks, dusted off for her. If it carried, the seizure would not wait on the debt. The colony could resume the bottomland for common use at vote season, 4 weeks out, debt or no debt, field or no field. Common use, Wren said. Krell's frontage in a gravel pit, I've heard. I'm not here as the board's mouth, Beck said. I'm here because I sat in that room and I watched beings I have loaned money to for 40 years convince themselves of a thing, and I came to say it to your face while it can still be of use. The factor's gray face worked. It is not about the credits anymore, Wren. They would forgive the credits tomorrow if you would only put the light out. The light is the offense. Every dusk it comes on and calls the whole valley wrong, and they will vote against being called wrong before they will vote against anything. Bex turned to go, then stopped. It would cost you nothing. Dark the lens 4 weeks, let the vote die down, relight it after. That's all it would take. 1 month of dark. I am advising you as a friend. Sefin watched Wren take that in, really take it in, weigh it. Because she weighed everything, she was her arithmetic father's child, whatever the valley thought. And he watched her shake her head slowly, with something close to apology in it. If they're in the corridor now, she said, they've been falling toward that light for years, Imla. The 1 month I go dark might be the month. It was always going to be somebody's month. I won't have it be theirs twice. Bex held her eyes a moment, sighed the long vray sigh that had closed 1,000 farm accounts and said, then it goes to a vote. I'm sorry. The factor was a kilometer up the depot road when the first green flicker showed over the western rim of the brace, where weather came from. Pell saw it from the grader and shut the blade down mid-pass. Sefin felt it before he saw it. Every Tellusk in the valley would have, the pressure sliding off the day like a load coming off a strap, vents tightening, dust lids dropping of their own accord. Wren stood in the middle of her 1,000 meters of nearly finished ground and watched the whole western sky turn the color of old bruise shot through, with that sick stormlight green, stacked from the rim of the valley to higher than fairies fly. Line storm, Pell said from the cab flat, big one. Get the children home. They had 2 hours, and they spent them the way you spend the last air in a sealed room. The flags came up. The stakes were driven flush so the wind couldn't harvest them. The stone sled was chained to the dead anchor at midfield, and the drainage cuts Pell had insisted on against everyone's schedule. 3 days they could not afford, Wren had said at the time, and Pell had cut them anyway. Were opened at both ends with the long spade until Sephen's arms were dead from the elbow down. The light went on early. Wren cranked the pylon's guy lines until the graywood sang, looked once at the lens and said, "It rode out 40 Earth winters on a sea cliff. It can have one bad night on Huel," and there was nothing in her voice to argue with. The came down the brace the way the old stories said the first colony ship had come down. Sideways, screaming and uninsured. Sephen had stood line storms before. Every child of the valley had shuddered in, counting hail strikes on the roof to keep from counting their own heartbeats. He had never stood one outdoors in the open mouth of the bottomland, and he learned things about water in the first 10 minutes that no Telesk schoolroom had thought to mention. That rain at line storm pressure does not fall but arrives, all of it at once, a ceiling of it. That hail off the western rim came through in volleys, spaced like thrown handfuls, each stone the size of a knuckle and angry about something. That beneath all of it, under the white roar, you could hear the fen at the valley bottom begin to stand up out of its bed and walk. They were in the equipment shed, the three of them, watching the grade drowned by lamplight, when the sound came through the storm that did not belong to the storm. A herd bellowing. Not complaint, Sephen knew herd complaint. The whole valley was fluent in Krell's animals. But the other sound, the one they made twice in a life, penned and rising water and nowhere to put their feet. Wren was up before the sound finished arriving. "His pens are on the low shelf," she said, dragging her storm coat off the nail. "Fen comes up through that ground first. He'll have gone to the depot before the line hit. There's nobody at that holding but the animals." She was already at the door. She stopped exactly 1 second, and Sephen watched her run arithmetic with the whole of her face. The south third of the grade was taking water. The drainage cuts wanted clearing every quarter hour. The stakes of 6 weeks of work were in the ground behind her, and every hour she was gone the field would spend what she could not repay. "The grade's mine," Pell said from the lamp. "I cut those drains. Go get the man's animals." They went over the boundary fence in the dark, the two of them, into water that hadn't existed at supper time. Krell's holding was 400 meters down the low shelf, and they did it half-blind. Sephen in front, because Telesk feet read ground, and his dust lids gave him something like sight in the spray. The pens, when they found them, were a bedlam of black water and lightning-lit backs. 40 animals piled against the high-side rails hard enough to crack them. Hock deep going stifle deep, and the gate latch was underwater and jammed with storm trosh. "Cut it," Wren shouted, and Sephen cut it, both thumbs and the fence tool, while she went in among the animals, went into the crush, a thing he would not have done for any wage on Huel, and got her coat off and over the lead animal's eyes, and turned it by the head the way her father used to, and where the lead went the herd followed. They drove them up the lane bellowing, 40 head through a gap in a flooded dark, Sephen at the rear flank with his vent screaming cold, and they put them on the high pasture inside Krell's east fence, and pegged the gate, and stood gasping, finished. And that was when the lightning gave them the valley entire, 1 full second of it, white as noon. Sephen never forgot what the second showed him. The fen flooding silver across the whole bottom shelf. The herd, safe, steaming, streaming off the high ground in 40 directions of indignation. Wren Calloway with her soaked coat back in one fist, and her face turned not toward her own land but back along the corridor line, east, up the axis of the valley where the approach would come, checking, in the middle of all of it, with everything she owned drowning behind her, that the light was still burning. It was. Small and green and stubborn under the storm, the only made thing visible in the world. It nearly wasn't. They came back over the boundary fence into the tail of the storm to find Pell at the threshold end with a hand lamp, fighting something, and the something was the pylon. The windward guy line had parted at the splice, and the graywood was leaning 4 degrees off plumb and working, looser with every gust, the lens still burning at the top of it like a lamp held by a drunk. Another hour of that wind and the whole mast would go over, and 70 centimeters of irreplaceable pre-collapse glass would meet the one-stone sled, chained at midfield, and the argument with the valley would be over by morning in the worst of all possible ways. "Cell housings fouling the spare line," Pell shouted over the wind, her old hands bleeding rope burn. "Someone has to free the cleat at the collar. Top of the mast." "In this?" Sephen heard himself say, and the wind took the words, which was a mercy, because Wren was already climbing. He held the baseline with Pell and watched her go up the staggered foot pegs into the gusts, 4 meters 6, the mast moving under her like a live thing, hail still coming through and spent volleys off the rim. At the collar, she locked her legs around the wood, bare hands in the wet dark 2 handspans from the burning lens, close enough that the green lit her face like deep water, and worked the fouled cleat free and bent the spare line on, and rode the mast through one gust that drew an involuntary sound out of every being below, and came down with the line in her teeth like a woman who had merely stepped up to trim a wick. They winched the pylon back to plumb and doubled every anchor in the streaming dark, and when it was done she stood with one hand flat on the graywood, the checking touch, and said, to Pell, to him, to the storm, it was never clear, it doesn't go over, whatever else goes over. Not this. Sefin slept 4 hours and dreamed of green water and woke to the bill. Dasso Krell came home at gray dawn to find his pens cracked open and empty and his herd grazing his own east pasture, every animal alive, and the story of how already moving through the valley faster than he could walk it down. He came to the boundary fence at mid-morning. He stood there a long time in the wreckage light, working his vents, watching the Callaway woman and the drawl boy and old Peladuba shovel silt out of a drainage cut enclosed that had not been dry in a day. He did not scream over the fence. He did not say anything over the fence. He looked the way you look at a sum gone wrong on a slate you were sure of, and then he went away, and the next morning the water board posted that the Callaway irrigation shares, the ones he'd bought at the lien sale with the whole depot watching, had been transferred back for the consideration of 1 credit. He never spoke of it. As far as Sefin could learn, to the end of the season he never spoke of that night at all, and when the petition went around a second time for fresh signatures, Dasso Krell's name was not on it, and his fence post stood empty of him from then on. The storm bought her one enemy's silence and cost her nearly everything else. The south third of the grade was under 30 centimeters of fen silt. 200 meters of crown had washed flat where the older cut, the one dug before Pell's drains, had failed and gone over the bank. The pump house, roofless since the tin sale, had flooded to the sills and the pump with it. Sefin walked the strip with Pell at noon while Wren was still pulling the pump, and watched the old woman do the figures on the back of her flag book, and watched her cross them out, and do them again as if the storm might apologize, and the second figures came out the same as the first. 18 days' work gone, Pell said. We had 26 in hand. You see the trouble. The vote's in 22. That's the trouble, Pell said. The valley saw it too. That was the bitter half of the storm's gift. The same night that shut Dasso Krell's mouth opened everyone else's. The line storm had taken the valley's roofs and fences and a season's hay, and beings who have lost a roof do their arithmetic in shorter columns. What the brace saw, looking down from its damaged porches, was 1,000 meters of ruined nothing in the best bottomland on Huel, land that could have been carrying 1,100 tons of silk rye through the storm in deep root and standing up out of it gold, the way Callaway silkery had stood up out of every storm for 15 years. The depot slate got a new line that week, odds on and ugly, that the strip would never see a single landing of any kind before the board took it. The younger Vanek wrote it. There were plenty of takers. The board moved its vote up 9 days in view of storm reconstruction priorities, and scheduled it for the equinox sitting, and that was Voradral's hand, and everyone knew it. Reconstruction was the kindest word ever found for a gravel pit. Ruktarn, who chaired the board the way a weather vane chairs a roof, gave the motion his voice within the hour. Sefin learned of it at his own family's table, which was how his mother intended him to learn it. She set the sitting's agenda down by the bread, equinox date circled, and said nothing at all, and her hands were perfectly still while she said it. It was Mock who put words on it, because Mock could no more leave a winning position unspoken than fly. 13 days, little brother. Then it's common land, the light comes down, and the valley gets its evenings back. You can help me re-roof the far barn like a drawl instead of carrying water for a— Finish it, Sefin said, and heard his own voice come out with something in it that made even Mock's vents flatten. The table went very quiet. His father studied the honey jar. Like a drawl, Mock finished lamely, and that was the end of suppers all together at the drawl house for that season. What Sefin remembered afterward about those 13 days was not the work, though the work was the hardest of his life. Silt out, crown rebuilt, the drains recut deeper, Pell's grader running dawn to dark and Pell asleep in the cab between passes because her house had storm damage too and she would not spend the daylight on it. What he remembered was the arithmetic of help and the way it would not stay zero. It had been 4 children at the start, then Pell. After the storm, it was the Millhouses, both families, parents included, who had watched a woman go into rising water for a neighbor's herd that hated her and had drawn their own conclusions on their own porches. Then it was the smith's apprentice with a straightened pylon brace she had forged at night off the books. Then, silently, in the worst of the silt week, it was Essick Drawl and his hauler every evening after his own repairs, and Sefin worked beside his father in the dark and neither of them said the name Vora, and the lens came on each dusk above them while they worked, and his father looked up at it each time it lit, and once, only once, said, as if continuing conversation begun years before, "Your grandmother stood on the survey line when they staked it. Whole valley turned out to watch. There was bunting, and nothing more. 12 helpers by the last week. 13 if you counted what no one could prove, that the depot's fuel clerk had begun misreading the meter in Wren's favor with a consistency that defied chance. 91 names on a petition. 13 helpers in the silt. A board sliding towards seizure on the equinox, and the lean clock under it all, ticking. Sefin hung the numbers side by side in his head some nights like weights on a balance arm, and watched them refuse to mean anything at all, because the only number that had ever mattered was the one nobody on Hewell possessed, where, in 11 dark years of slow sky, 3 old fairies and their mother arcs had gotten to. If they existed, they were aimed at a light a kilometer from his bed. If they did not, then his mother was right. The valley was right, the finding was right, and the bravest being he had ever met was spending herself to 0 on a dead frequency, and he was helping her do it. He was helping her do it either way. He had stopped being able to imagine otherwise. Somewhere between the stone sled and the storm, without any moment he could name, Calloway's madness had become the only work in the Brace Valley that felt like it was about anything, and Sefin Drawl had concluded, privately, in the Telesque way, where conclusions are load-bearing and not for discussion, that if the sky stayed empty, she was not going to stand in that empty field at the end of it alone. The lens dealer came 8 days before the vote, and Sefin nearly didn't recognize the danger, because the danger arrived politely, in a clean coat, and offered to solve everything. His name was Othel. Of Ray, but nothing like Beck's, a salvage and antiquities factor off the trade spine, with a cargo case full of careful padding and a voice like oiled hinges. He had heard, the way his kind heard everything, that there was pre-collapse approach glass in the Brace Valley, intact, original housing, provenance traceable to an Earth coastal field. He stood at a respectful distance from the pylon, with his hands folded, and looked up at the lens the way the depot men looked at the betting slate. 9,000, he said, standing offer, no condition. I'll tell you honestly what you will never hear from a dealer again in your life. It's over the market. Collectors on the spine pay for earth glass, but they pay 8 for museum pieces with papers. I'm offering 9 because the piece is live and the story travels with it. The light that burned a year on a frontier world, waiting for the dead. He let that sit, with the satisfaction of a being who knew the size of the lien to the half credit, because everyone on the depot road knew the size of the lien. 9 clears your debt, your fuel, your seed for spring, and the board's whole case against you, madam. The motion dies. You keep your land. You replant. The only thing that leaves this valley is a piece of glass. And there it was, laid out in the dealer's mild voice, the door out. Every ruin of the past year reversed by one nod. Sefin, standing at the field edge with a coil of marker wire in his hands, found he had stopped breathing, not because he feared she'd take it, but because for one full second he wanted her to, wanted it with a guilty completeness that shamed him, the whole quiet life of the valley restored at the price of one green eye. Wren looked at the lens for a while. Then she asked, in a voice of genuine curiosity, the only question she apparently had, "And your buyers? Would they light it?" Othel's hands unfolded and folded again. It would be conserved, climate-cased, displayed, certainly, for beings of discernment, behind glass, Wren said. A light behind glass. She shook her head slowly, and Sefin watched the dealer mistake it for negotiation and watched him learn otherwise across the next 30 seconds, and the learning seemed to cost the Vray something real. "It's not a story that travels with it," she said, not unkindly. "It's an appointment. Take the 9 to the spine and buy something that isn't expected somewhere." When the dealer's skiff had whined away up the valley, she stood a moment looking at the pylon, and Sefin saw, because he had spent a season learning her face the way Telesque learned hands, the exact width of what she had just declined, and that she had declined it anyway, and that there had never at any point been a version of her that did not. She sold the seed stock the next morning instead. Sefin had not known, until the Mill family's wagon came to carry the casks to the depot scale, that the seed stock was even there to sell. 5 years of select silkery seed, her father's life's breeding, vacuum-cased against exactly the kind of catastrophe that had already happened. Cased seed of a proven line traded high to the North Valley growers. It was the one asset the plowing hadn't touched. It was also, in any arithmetic anyone owned, the only road back. Land could be reflooded with credit. A dead seed line could not. Selling the casks didn't pay a debt. It paid the lien down to where the board's debt clause lost its teeth and left only the misuse motion standing, and it announced, to a valley fluent in exactly this dialect, that Wren Calloway was never going to farm again. Burning the crop had been madness. Selling the line was apostasy. Even the millmen loading the wagon wouldn't meet her eye, and the depot was silent about it for a whole day, the way a depot goes silent around a thing too large to bet on. Pell ran the figures that evening and allowed that with the lean defanged and the aprons nearly packed, the field would be finished, lit, and standing 4 days before the equinox sitting. Which leaves them only the one honest question, she said, capping her flag book, and it isn't fallow misuse, and it never was. It's whether this valley can stand living next to that light. We'll hear the answer at the vote. Rook Tarn came out to the field himself, 5 days before the equinox, alone, which was the most surprising thing he did all season. The chairman walked the strip's full kilometer with his hands behind his back, taking his time, the inspection of a man who had been hearing about a folly for a year and was visibly unprepared to find it immaculate, and at the threshold he made Wren the colony's last offer, in the low practical murmur of a being who had survived 9 years of chairing by never once saying a hard thing loudly. The shape of it was this: withdraw the keeper's claim, deed the strip's ground to the colony voluntarily before the vote, and the board would let the motion lapse with dignity all around. The strip would be held as a common reserve. Tarn pronounced the words like an apology, left packed, left whole, against the day anyone ever wanted it. She could even keep the lens at the field edge by license, renewed annually at the board's pleasure. You'd lose nothing real, he said. The ground stays the ground. The light stays lit. All that changes is whose name carries it, and the valley stops tearing itself in half over one family's name. He spread his hands. I'm offering you everything but the being right, Wren. The whole loaf except the crust. No reasonable creature starves over a crust. Sephen, coiling flag line within earshot, thought it was the most dangerous thing anyone had said to her all year, because it was nearly true, and he watched her consider it honestly. She considered everything honestly. It was the most infuriating thing about her, standing in the wind with the chairman, looking down her 1,000 meters. At the board's pleasure, she repeated at last, renewed annually. And the year there's a tight budget or a new chairman or a bad storm and the valley wants the timber, the license dies in a committee on a wet afternoon, and nobody ever has to stand in the hall with their hand up to do it. She shook her head more gently than Sephen expected. You're not offering me the loaf minus the crust, Rook. You're offering to move the light from ground that answers to a promise onto ground that answers to a mood. I've seen what this valley's moods do to inconvenient promises. I've been watching one die since before you chaired. The answer's no. Put your hand up in the light where she'd have seen it and take the field in front of everyone, or don't take it at all. Tarn looked at her a long moment with an expression Sephen filed for years before he could name it. The specific weariness of a flexible man meeting a fixed point. You'd have made a fine chairman, he said, if you weren't constitutionally incapable of it, and walked back to his skiff and scheduled the vote. The sky answered first. 2 nights before the equinox, the corridor band woke up. Sephen was there when it happened, in the Callaway kitchen at the end of a 15-hour day, eating thatch cress soup with the receiver muttering its empty band mutter from the shelf where it had muttered for a year, a sound so constant, House had absorbed it, like the pump or the wind. He had stopped hearing it months ago. So had everyone, except the woman who had built her life around it. Wren put her spoon down mid-word. Sephen heard nothing for a moment. Then he heard it. Under the static, a rhythm. 3 pulses in a space. 3 pulses in a space, faint as a moth against a window, gone whole seconds at a stretch, then back, patient, on the exact frequency of a dead grandmother's voice. Wren crossed the kitchen the way she'd crossed it the night of Krell's herd. Her hands worked the receiver with a steadiness that was its own kind of scream. Gain, filter, the old loop antenna swung by hand a degree at a time. 3 pulses and a space. She held the headphone half off one ear, eyes nowhere, mouth moving, counting, and Sephen sat with his soup going cold in the skin of his arms, crawling and let himself for 1 minute all the way believe. It lasted 4 hours, long enough for the word to get out. He never knew how. He had told no one, but valleys know. Long enough for skiff lights and lamp-bearing neighbors to gather on the depot road above the bottomland inn. The dark, 24 of them, 3, drawn by the rumor of a rhythm, standing in a quiet he had never heard from any crowd in the brace. Long enough for Hope to put down a taproot. It was the oar tug Severin Quallet, inbound to the northern smelter, dragging a derelict barge whose rotation chopped the tug's running beacon into the corridor band like a blade through a light beam. 3 pulses and a space. The smelter's traffic office confirmed it before midnight, apologetic and amused to the operator at the depot. Known artifact, logged twice before in 11 years, nothing on the corridor, nothing behind the barge, but more nothing. The crowd on the depot road went home in 1s and 2s, not looking at each other, and the quality of the valley's anger changed that night, curdling from contempt into something with real hurt in it, because for 4 hours they had stood in the dark, and caught themselves wanting her to be right, and beings do not forgive being made to want. The younger Vanek said it at the scale house the next noon, loud to the whole queue. 4 hours of my mother on her knees in the yard, crying at a smelter tug. That's what the light buys this valley. The vote can't come fast enough. And the queue grumbled assent, and the slate odds lengthened again, and somewhere in 90 households the last soft feelings hardened over like the fen in frost. Sefin found Ren that night at the pylon, past the third hour after both moons, sitting on the cell crate with the maintenance lamp, the lens above her throwing its green out over a finished grade toward an east that had just been proven empty twice, once by 11 years, once by a smelter tug. The receiver's mutter drifted from the kitchen window across the dark, restored to static, faithful as ever to nothing. She had her grandmother's 2 lines from the crate lid in her hand. He knew the shape of the paper by then. The whole valley did. For the bottom field. You'll know when. I ran it tonight, she said, without preamble, without looking up. He understood she could only say this at all because it was him and because it was dark. All of it, the long way, the way my father would. 11 years of silence against 14 seconds of signal. The relay chain's failure rate against the ARC's failure rate. What it cost everyone here to live next to me being wrong against what it cost 3,000 people if I'm right. And the lights out the one. Night it matters. Her thumb moved over the chipped crescent of writing. You want to know the truth, Sefin? The honest sum? It doesn't come out. It has never once come out. The numbers don't know. The numbers have never known. Everyone in this valley keeps shouting arithmetic at me like I haven't done it, and I've done more of it than all of them stacked. And at the bottom of every page there's just the same remainder that won't divide. She looked up at the underside of the lens, the stepped rings of it dim jade above the lamp. She said, keep a light on the line. That's the whole of what I have. It isn't proof. It was never proof. It's just the only thing she asked of me, and the only end of the rope anyone left me to hold. Then why does it look like certainty, Sefin said quietly, from the fence. Because I decided, Ren said. That's all deciding is. You pick the thing you'll be wrong about, and you stop rending your spine out by the day. She folded the paper away and stood, and put her hand flat on the pylon the way other people touched a doorframe in passing, a checking touch, older than thought. They could be dust, Sefin. I've known it every single night, and lit it every single night anyway. And if that's madness, then the valley's right about me, and I can live with the valley being right about me. What I couldn't live with is the other thing. She picked up the lamp. 3 fairies live, field and light. We will find you. Nobody gets to be slow and lost. Not while I hold ground in this valley. The lens burned over both of them, steady, the only certainty on the field, and 2 nights later the equinox came, and Crossfin went to the hall to vote her off it. She would not go to the hall. Sefin had assumed the whole season that when the night came she would stand in front of the board and make them look at her while they did it. It was the only fight she had never picked, and he asked her why at midday, while they wheeled the last apron roller down the strip. Because there's nothing in that hall I can defend, Ren said. The field's here, the light's here. If the corridor picks tonight of all nights, somebody has to be standing where the work is. She heaved on the roller bar. The packed earth took the weight without a mark, a kilometer of it now, crowned and cambered and clean, and it had stopped looking like a wound or a farm or a folly. It had started looking like what it was, which was a finished thing, the only finished thing of its size on Hewell, pointing east. Besides, she said, with the flicker that passed across her face maybe twice a season, they'll be voting on whether I'm mad. It'd be rude to attend with evidence. So it was Sefin who went to the hall with his father through a market square so full of tethered skiffs and wagons that they had to walk the last 300 meters. The whole brace had turned out, and half the North Valley besides, packed onto benches under the old beam lights, humans in Telesk and the Depot Vray, the air thick with wet coats and tension. He had been in the hall 100 times, fee disputes, water allocations, the annual bridge argument. He had never seen it like this. It had the smell of a thing about to be done that everyone wanted done, and no one wanted to be seen doing. Rukaik Tarn chaired from the center of the long table with the other 12 ranged beside him, his mother fourth from the left with her hands folded on the agenda, and Tarn ran the preliminaries at a gallop. Storm levies, the bridge, waived, deferred, carried. Because the hall had come for one item and a weather vane knows where the air is moving. The motion was read. Resumption of Chartered Agricultural Parcel 9 South for common use, grounds of sustained fallow misuse. The clerk's voice did what clerks' voices do, made it sound like weather, like a thing that simply happened to land rather than a thing 13 beings were about to do to a neighbor. Tarn called for statements, and the hall, which had rehearsed this evening on its porches for half a year, delivered them. The elder Vanek spoke of the exchange, the valley standing, the offensive waste in a frontier economy where waste was the one unforgivable thing. A North Valley grower mourned the silkery line itself, the 15 years of breeding, as if the line had been a person and Wren its murderer rather than its heir. The Mill family's neighbor, not the Mill family's, Sefin noted. They sat in the third row with their arms crossed and their mouths shut, testified to the cruelty of the light, the false night of the smelter tug, his own mother in the yard in the cold believing for 4 hours. That one did damage. It was meant to. By the time he sat down, the hall had its verdict in its teeth. It was somewhere in the middle of the fifth statement, the younger Vanek, working through the betting slate's greatest insults with the cadence of a man who'd practiced at a mirror, that Sefin Drawl discovered he was standing up. He had no memory of deciding. That frightened him at the time and comforted him for the rest of his life. That the body could simply conclude on its own, after a season of stone and silt and storm water, that it would not stay in its seat. The hall noise fell away in rings, the way a pond goes quiet around a dropped stone, because everyone knew whose son he was, and everyone could count the chairs between him and the woman fourth from the left, whose hands had stopped being folded. I carried stone on that field since the first week, Sefin said. His voice cracked on the second word and steadied on the third. I want to say what's actually in the motion, not the clause, the thing itself. Sit down, boy, someone said from the dark, not unkindly. Your mother is on the board and knows where I've been every day for a season, and will manage, thank you. A single bark of laughter somewhere. Even Tarn's mouth twitched. The hall let him live. Sefin put his eyes on the long table, because he could not yet put them on the fourth chair, and he laid it out the way Pell had taught him to walk a grade, one straight line, no detours. 20 years ago, this colony took a charter discount because we sat under a lift corridor and promised a field we never built. Every adult in this hall knows it, and the ones who voted it quietly dead are most of the ones on that bench. Maybe that was sound. Ships went dark. Dead ships need no runway. I've heard the arithmetic my whole life, and I can't fault a line of it. He took a breath. Then one woman built the field anyway, alone on her own ground out of her own pocket, at a cost you've all itemized at that depot until the list is longer than the strip. She took nothing from this colony. Not a credit, not an hour. The storm took the valley's roofs. She was in Krell's pens that night up to her hips in black water saving a herd that wasn't hers, and you all know that too. It just doesn't fit on the slate. Krell was in the hall far back by the doors. He did not move, and he did not look away, and his silence sat in the room like a 14th board member. So the motion isn't about misuse, Sefin said. Land's never been better used in this valley. Ask the grader operator who's crowned every road you drove here on. The motion is that her light makes this colony look at its broken promise every single night, and we would rather take her ground than keep being looked at. He turned finally to the fourth chair, to the still hands and the slate eyes that were his own eyes, and the last of the fear burned off him, leaving something cold and clear and load-bearing. You taught me the season count, Mother. A season counted twice is still one season. Don't spend the same coin in 2 ledgers. The colony already spent this coin. We sold the promise once for a discount. Tonight we'd be selling it the second time for frontage and gravel and calling the arithmetic clean. He sat down into a silence with real weight in it. That's all. I wanted it said in the room once before the hands go up. What he remembered afterward was not the murmur, or Tarn gaveling it down, or the sixth statement that tried to restart the evening's momentum and ran out of fuel in half a minute. What he remembered was his mother's hands. They did not fold again. They lay flat on the agenda, perfectly still, but flat now, open and voradrawl. When the statements closed and the board's own discussion came, said precisely nothing. The first motion in 9 years on which the board's best arithmetic declined to show its working. Beck spoke once as lien holder of record, dryly noting for the minutes that the debt clause was satisfied and could not be aground, and that the factor's office took no view on light. It was the nearest thing to a defense the table produced. The vote went up in the old way, hands in the beam light, 9-4. 4 against. Beck's seat, the schoolmistress, the bridge engineer, and, his hand rising with the slow finality of a counterweight, his face like quarrystone, Essex Drawl, who had sat on that board for 11 years and never once voted against his wife. Vora's hand did not go up at all. An abstention, the clerk recorded. In the Drawl family dialect of hands, Sefin would think later, it was the loudest thing his mother said that year. Carried, Rooktarn said, and had the grace or the cowardice to say it quietly. Resumption at noon tomorrow. Improvements, the hall flinched politely at the word, to be assessed and compensated per schedule. The light and pylon, as movable property, exempt, to be removed by the owner within 10 days. Noon tomorrow. They could have set it for the next quarter day. The month's end, any decent distance. Nons Tarnson reading the air one last time. Get it done before anyone's nerve failed, before the abstention spread. The hall emptied fast, the way halls do when the thing wanted is the thing done and no one wishes to stand around beside it. Sefin came out into the cold square between his father and the knight, and the first thing every eye in the crowd did, every eye, the 9 hands and the 4 and the 91 names and the children on shoulders, was go east, down the valley, to the small green star burning at the edge of Parcel 9 South, burning over a field that as of noon would belong to all of them, and a light that would belong to a wagon. No one spoke about it. Everyone looked. The whole of Crossafin stood in the square with its verdict in its pocket, looking east at the thing it had just voted off the land, and the light looked back, and Sefin understood with sudden totality what Bex had tried to tell her weeks ago. It had never been about the field at all. You could seize a field. The vote had passed, and the field was gone, and the light was still saying, across the dark, to every upturned face in the market square, the one thing it had said every night for a year, I am still expecting them. And there was no clause in the charter that could make it stop meaning that. His father touched his shoulder once at the wagon. Go, Essex said. I'll square it at home. A man's vote should cost him a quiet evening at minimum, or it wasn't a vote. So Sefin went, down the depot road at a telescope, past skiffs and silent walkers, and he was not the only one moving east instead of home. He counted lamps. Behind him on the road and stopped counting at 20, because in the Brace Valley you went where the thing was happening, and everyone seemed to feel, in the small cold hours of the equinox, with the seizure 11 hours from taking effect, that the bottomland was where the thing was. He found Wren at the threshold of the strip, with Pell and the Mill families and the Smith's apprentice, lamps staked out down the kilometer like a second constellation, and she was not grieving and she was not raging. She was working. They all were. The last apron, the western turnout, the only piece left unfinished on Pell's book, was getting its final pack by lamplight at midnight on the night the colony took the field away. She looked up at him once, read the verdict in his face, nodded as if confirming a delivery date, and threw him the second roller bar. Noon was all she asked. Noon, he said. Then we finish by dawn, said Wren Calloway. And it goes to them finished. Whole lit. Let them seize the real thing, with the bunting on it, in front of everybody. The corridor doesn't care whose name is on the parcel. And if the valley wants this light down, the valley can climb the pylon itself. The lamps on the depot road kept coming. That was the strangeness of that night, the part the valley would argue about for a generation. Who came and why? Not the believers. There were no believers left, except possibly Itty Mauer. The smelter tug had cauterized belief out of the brace. They came the way you come to a deathbed or a launching, because a large thing was ending in the valley and ending things ask for witnesses. They came because they had voted for noon and discovered the vote sitting strangely in them on the cold walk home. They came because their children were already there. By the second hour after midnight, there were 60-some beings on the bottomland, and the ones who would not set foot on the seized parcel stood along the boundary fence in a line. The same fence, Sefin noted, the same exact rails Krell had hammered with his fists a year ago and watched the lamps move on the strip and held their own lamps, so that the field lay between 2 strings of light like a thing being decided. Some of them, unable to stand holding a lamp doing nothing, put the lamp down and picked up a roller bar. The elder Vanek was one. He did not explain himself, and nobody asked him to. He packed apron clay in his hall clothes beside the Smith's apprentice for 2 hours, and what he said to Wren, the only thing he said all night, was the slate's wiped. There'll be no settling of it either way. It was poorly done. And Wren said it was honestly done. Leave it up, and that was either mercy or the longest knife in the valley, and Vanek packed clay until his coat was ruined and seemed to feel better for it. They finished at the 4th hour. Peladuba walked the western apron with her flag book under the field lamps, boots testing, eyes half shut, the whole valley quiet around her. And Sefin understood that whatever the charter said at noon, the field had only ever had one owner of record that mattered, and it was the old woman reading the ground with her feet. At the turnout's end she stopped, made a final mark, and closed the book. Done, Pell said. To the strip, not the crowd. 1,000 meters, packed and crowned, lit and turned. 20 years and a season late. She looked down the kilometer at the pylon, and her voice came out of her younger than her face. Hewell Field is open. Nobody cheered. The line at the fence shifted, lamps swaying. It was 8 hours to noon, and everyone seemed to hear that arithmetic at the same time, and it was at that exact moment Sefin would swear it to his hatchlings, and his father, who was there by then, would back him. And 100 other witnesses would move the timing around in the telling, but not by much, that Edie Moore, who against every parental instruction in the colony had never gone home, who was standing her shift at the contact lever because dusk to dawn was dusk to dawn and seizure or no seizure the light was lit, screamed. A child's scream cuts a crowd to silence faster than any gavel. Then she was shouting, In the broken double voice of a Telesque hatchling forgetting her second language, pointing not east up the corridor, but at the kitchen window of the Calloway house, where the receiver's mutter had been drifting unattended across the yard all night. The mutter had words in it. Afterward, the depot operator's official account would put first acquisition at 11 minutes past the 4th hour. What Safin had instead of an official account was the memory of 60 beings crossing a packed kilometer at a dead run and stacking into a farm, kitchen and its yard, and total silence falling over them in rings, and in the middle of the silence a woman's hand on a gain dial, fine-tuning with the steadiness of someone diffusing her own heart, and out of 11 years of static, cresting and sinking and cresting like a swimmer in heavy sea, a human voice. Ferry Flight Euro 1 to any Huel station. Repeat. Lights out on relay, dropping on survey data and visual. We have, the sea took it. The kitchen did not breathe. 3 vessels, souls aboard 2,981, requesting any ground confirmation. If anyone is keeping the old corridor, show us. We've been a long time coming and we are asking, Huel. Show us the line, static. The crowd in the yard stood like a planted thing. Sefin heard his own pulse in his vents, and beside him, an old human mill hand saying no, 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 very softly, which was not denial but its opposite, a man bailing disbelief out of himself as fast as it rose. Wren picked up the handset. If her hand shook, Sefin could not see it, and he was looking. Yarrow Huel, she said. This is Calloway ground station in Brace Valley on the old corridor. She paused one beat, and into that pause 11 years, 2 funerals, 1 plowed under livelihood, and 400 lit nights packed themselves and stood at attention. Your line is lit. Green, stepped lens, pre-collapse standard, threshold of a 1,000-meter packed strip running 085 true. Light's been on every night for a year. It'll be on when you get here. Huel keeps the corridor. The static breathed. Then the voice came back, and it had changed. The procedure had cracked off it like ice off a cable, and underneath was something young and ragged that had plainly not expected, after 11 years of dead relays, to be answered by anyone at all. Say again the light, Calloway ground. You're telling me the green is real? We picked it up 40 minutes ago on the long optics, and the flight deck called it a sensor ghost. We've been, the sea again then. There's crew crying on my deck, ground station. Confirm the green is yours. Confirm the green is for us. Wren closed her eyes, only that, and Sefin watched 400 nights arrive somewhere all at once. Confirm, she said. The green is for you. It was always for you. Bring them down, Yarrow 1. We'll feed you at the field. What happened in the yard then had no name in either of Sefin's languages. It was not cheering. It had too much weeping in it for that, and too many beings sitting down hard on the cold ground where they stood. The line of lamps at the boundary fence broke and poured onto the strip, the vote dissolving at 4:30 in the morning without motion or minutes, repealed by acclamation of the running, and through the middle of it the practical voices started up. Pell's first, then Wren's, then to his own surprise Sefin's. Because a kilometer of packed earth was about to receive ferries older than the colony in the dark, 3 of them, on visual approach, and the dark before dawn has fence posts and skiffs and children in it. Clear the strip. Pell on the grader's horn, sweeping her lamp. Everything off the pack. Skiffs behind the pump house, wagons to the lane, younglings to the fence, and hold them there. Fire flags at both aprons, Wren called, cool as a harvest morning, pointing beings into rows. Water from the mill houses, every cask. Krell, and Dasso Krell was simply there, materialized out of the crowd with his sleeves already turned. And what passed between them was 4 words and a nod. A whole year settled at one stroke and never reopened. Blankets, Wren said. All of them. You'll have my barn too, said Krell, and went. The first retro flare bloomed over the eastern rim of the Brace Valley at 12 minutes before, the 5th hour while the night was still whole. A point of violent orange opening into a long tearing line of it, dropping down the exact axis Peladuba had helped stake before any of 3 generations were born, down the old corridor dead center, as if the sky had been holding the survey all along. The sound arrived late, a rolling shudder off the valley walls that set every herd in the Brace bellowing, and the crowd on the bottomland made a noise under it, low and involuntary, the sound 1,000 certainties make breaking at once. Light her up full, Wren said. Itty more through the lever. The lens went from its night burn to full aperture, and the green beam stood up the valley like a drawn line, and out of the dark above the eastern rim, impossibly and takely, a machine the size of the colony hall caught the green, dipped one wing in acknowledgement as old as flight, and turned on to final approach. Yarrow 1 on the line, said the radio voice, raw. We have the green. We have it. We have it. Skids down. 3 minutes. It came down the kilometer with its landing lights staring, and its hull glowing faint with entry heat, a blunt, scarred, beautiful slab of pre-collapse honesty, and it put its skids on the packed clay of a plowed under silkery field within 10 meters of Peladuba's centerline every time, forever, just as she'd said, and rolled out the length of the strip shedding thunder and stopped 200 meters from the pylon. For a moment, nothing in the valley moved except heat shimmer. Then the forward hatch unsealed with a sound like a held breath let go, and the ramp came down, and the first human being out of the ladder lift in 26 years stood at the top of it in a patched flight suit, gripping the rail, looking out at 60 lamps and a green light in a finished field that every chart in her possession said did not exist. She was young, Wren's age, born in the dark between stars, daughter of the lift rather than passenger of it. She looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at her, and the first words exchanged on Hewell Field, the words that went on to the bronze eventually, were hers, called down the ramp in a homeworld accent gone strange and lovely with 11 years of isolation. "Whose light?" And 60 voices answered, human and Telesconvray together, pointing one direction, and what they shouted was a name. The pilot's name was Asha Quill, second-generation flight officer of the Ark Yarrow, and she came down the ramp on legs that had never once stood on a planet, and the first thing she did on any world was walk past every offered hand to the foot of the graywood pylon and put her palm flat against it. The checking touch, the same touch, and stand there with her head bowed while the lens burned above her. The second thing she did was turn around and become, for the next 30 hours, the hardest working being in the Brace Valley, because 2,981 souls were stacked in 3 old ferries and 2 dying arcs, and the night was cold, and gratitude is a cargo you unload later. The arithmetic of that night, Sefin would spend years explaining to beings who hadn't stood in it. 3 ferries. Each lifted a little over 300 at maximum stuffing, and each turnaround down the corridor, unload, climb back to the arcs, reload, return, ran near 3 hours with machines that old. The Yarrow group had come the last stretch of 11 years on systems, triaged down to air, heat for the sleep bays, and thrust in that order. Their long-range transmitter had been the first organ sacrifice. That was the silence, the whole black mystery of it. Not death, just a budget line aboard as well as ashore, power for the living bought with power for the talking. They had dropped toward a world they had no way to hail, on survey data old enough to vote, betting everything on a promise of a field and a light made a generation ago, because, as Quill put it flatly at the foot of the ramp, there had been nothing else left to bet on. The lift's other groups had richer options, she said. We had the corridor or the dark. Then 40 minutes out, the optics caught a green point, exactly where the survey said a threshold should be, and the deck called it a ghost, and our flight chief, she stopped and restarted, with care. Our flight chief said no, said it was the standard, said someone was keeping it. The chief's in the last ferry load. You'll want to meet the chief. Wren, who was directing water casks 2 meters away, did not hear that, or seemed not to. Sefin heard it and filed it in the Telesk way. Dawn came up on a valley remaking itself. Later, the official tellings made it sound organized, and it was the opposite of organized. It was 1,000 private decisions arriving at the same answer faster than any board could have voted them. The mill families had their ovens going by the second landing, and then the mill itself running, and then, without anyone asking, every oven in Crossfin lit in a chain of kitchens down the valley, and the depot road filled with wagons moving both directions, empty east, loaded west. Krell's barn took the first 300, blankets wall to wall, and when it filled, other barns simply opened, one after another, the way doors do when the question has stopped being whether and become how many. The schoolmistress had the hall benches dragged out by the same crowd that had sat on them to vote, and the hall became a nursery, because cold sleep is hardest on the smallest, and 41 of the souls aboard were children under 5. Sefin worked the ramp queues all morning and could never afterward describe the faces except by what they did. They came down blinking at the sky, a sky, any sky, and the valley wind hit them, the green hay and fin smell of an ordinary Hewell morning, and being after being, human after human, stopped dead on the ramp as if the air itself were a wall, until the line behind compelled them forward. A woman his mother's age knelt at the bottom and put both hands in the mud, just held them there, ruining her sleeves, laughing. An old man, older than anyone in the valley, a passenger of the original boarding, touched Sefin's arm at the queue head and asked, in slow trade tongue, whether this world had rain, real rain, falling rain. More than we'd like, Sefin told him, and the old man wept with his whole face and shook Sefin's arm, and would not stop thanking him, as if Sefin had personally arranged the weather. And through it all, down the whole length of that morning, every single one of them did the same thing somewhere between the ramp and the wagons. Everyone, without exception, until Sefin stopped marveling and started simply watching for it. They looked for the light. Word had gone around the ferries on the climb down, arc to arc, deck to deck, the way the only good news in 11 years goes around. They came down the ramp and their eyes swept the field and found the graywood pylon, and the stepped green ring burning at the top of it in broad daylight. Wren had not shut it off. She said the corridor wasn't empty till the last ferry was down, and nobody on Huel was ever going to argue light discipline with her again. And they touched fingers to lips or chest or brow, each in the manner of wherever on drowned old earth their families had once been from, and walked on. By mid-morning, the foot of the pylon had things laid on it: ration tags, a child's bracelet, a folded flight patch, threadbare, in lift colors. Nobody started it. Nobody could have stopped it. Ruke Tarn arrived at the 7th hour, in his chairman's coat, with the assessor and the noon resumption in a folder under his arm, and got out of his skiff into a parcel of common-use land occupied by 1,100 refugees, 40 wagons, 200 volunteers, a 1,000-meter operational airfield, and the smell of all the bread in Crossfin, and stood holding his folder like a man who has brought a fishing rod to a flood. Nobody jeered him. Nobody needed to. He stood at the strip's edge a long while, watching a ferry unload, and then he took off the chairman's coat, rolled it into the back of his skiff, and carried water the rest of the day, and the folder was never seen again in the history of the colony. The spine did not believe it. That was its own small comedy, played out at the depot operator's desk across the first morning while the ferries cycled. Hewelfield's report of 3,000 inbound souls off the ladder lift went up the official channels and came back down stamped with polite, institutional concern. The smelter's traffic office requested confirmation of the transmitting station's licensing status. A factor's circuit clerk, 11 years custodian of the terminal drift finding, replied that vessels designated lost could not be logged as arriving without a review cycle, and proposed one for the following quarter. A spine news service asked, in apparent seriousness, whether the colony was certain the ferries were not a reenactment. Quill took the desk handset for that one. "Confirm reenactment negative," she said, in the voice of a woman 29 hours awake. "I have 2,981 souls who declined to be dead on schedule, a flight deck that's been breathing its own filters for 11 years, and a farm girl's green light that did the job your relay chain was paid for. File whatever you like. We'll be at supper." Then she put the handset down with exaggerated care and went back to the ramp queues. And the depot operator framed nothing, because the slate above the door would eventually say it better. What the official channels could not process, the unofficial ones carried at a sprint. By the second morning, there were chartered skiffs over the rim with camera crews aboard, and a relief mission from the northern townships nobody had asked for and everybody fed, and the first of the messages that would not stop coming for a year, from worlds Crossfin had never traded with, from beings who had lost their own slow ships in other corridors in other decades, all of them asking some dialect of the same question. How did you know to keep the light? The keeper of Huel Field answered every one of them, eventually in her own hand, and the answer never varied and never satisfied a single recipient, because it was 4 words long and contained no method. "We didn't. We promised." His mother came at the 8th hour. Seffen saw the drawhouse wagon on the depot road from a distance and lost track of it in the chaos of the third landing, and when he next saw Vora Drawl, she was already in the thick of it. Of course she was. Whatever else his mother was, she was the best logistics mind on the board, and 1,000 sol intake was a problem exactly the shape of her. She had the hall's nursery inventoried within the hour, the kitchens rotated onto shifts, the barn allocations rationalized. She commandeered Beck's and the factor's whole tally apparatus for billeting, and the factor went gladly, outranked for the first time in 40 years and looking relieved about it. She did not go near the strip's threshold. She worked the far end, the receiving end, all day, with her hands and her tables and her terrifying competence, and at no point did she come to where Wren was, and Seffen understood that too. His mother was answering the only way her spine knew how, in freight handled and children fed, and the words would have to come later or never. They came at dusk as it happened, and they were not addressed to Wren at all. The 4th from last ferry run was inbound, the valley walls going gold, the lens lifting from dayburn to full as the light failed, and Seffen was at the threshold managing the flag line when his mother appeared beside him, with 2 bowls and handed him one, and stood eating beside him in silence, watching the green catch the dusk in front of the entire valley. Vents open, hands unguarded, a drawl at the foot of the Callaway light in public, at mealtime. There was no clause in any charter written that said it louder. "You stood up well," Vora said at last to the field in general, in the hall. "Your grandmother stood up like that on the survey line when the bunting was out." She finished her bowl with the deliberateness of a closing argument. "The board meets at next quarter day to regularize all this. The motion will be to vacate the resumption, restore the parcel, and charter the field as colony infrastructure with the Callaway holding endowed as keeper's land in perpetuity." A pause, 1 beat, precisely measured. "I drafted it this morning, between the bread and the blankets. It will carry 13 to nothing, because I will be watching every hand. She took his empty bowl, stacked it in hers, and looked at her middle son, and in the slate eyes that were his eyes, there was something he had waited his whole life to see pointed at him. And it was not apology, because his mother did not apologize, and it did not need to be. Arithmetic is never wrong, she said, but it is never the whole field. Your father has been insufferable about that phrase since the equinox. Don't you start. And she walked back up the valley to her tables, and that was the whole of it, and it was everything. And Sephan stood holding a flag in the dusk wind with his vents aching and could not have said one word in either of his languages if the corridor itself had asked him to. The last ferry of the lift cycle came down at full dark, 29 hours after the first, and it carried what the crews had saved till the end the way you save the most fragile cargo for the calmest hands. The eldest, the frailest, the long sleepers, and the flight chief of the Yarrow group who had refused all 11 years to let the optics stop being calibrated to one green standard, and who came down the ramp last of all the lift very slowly on a flight officer's arm. The crowd at the threshold had thinned and quieted by then. The work had moved up valley with the wagons. So there was room and a kind of hush when the last passenger reached the bottom of the ramp and stopped and stood looking down the strip at the pylon, at the lens, for a long moment, and then said in a voice that carried, dry and cracked and unmistakably in charge, "Well, they kept it lit then. Where's my granddaughter?" Etta Calloway was 81 years old, and the dark between stars had spent 11 of those years trying to fold her up and had visibly lost. She stood at the ramp foot in a flight chief's jacket worn to the weave, white hair cropped like a pilot's, one hand on the officer's arm and the other already waving off the medic following her with a chair, and Sephan's first absurd thought, watching her scan the threshold crowd with quick pale eyes, was that he finally understood where the steadiness in Wren's hands had come from. It was a family issue. It went back generations. There was probably no cure. The crowd at the threshold opened, the way crowds do for these things without anyone arranging it. Wren had been at the flag line. She came through the open lane at an ordinary walk. That was the thing Sephan told ever afterward, that she walked, the only unhurried being on the field, as if the appointment had been in both their books for 11 years, and there was no cause to jostle, and stopped an arm's length away, and the two of them looked at each other, the woman who had sent 14 seconds across a dying relay and the child who had spent them. "You're taller," Etta said. "You're late," said Wren. "Years," the old woman agreed. "Slow." And then, with the ghost of a cracked smile, watching her granddaughter's face the way a gunner watches a range, not lost. It was Wren who broke. Sephan had seen her stand off aboard, a storm, a valley, a year. He had never once seen her face do what it did then, all of it at once. The whole withheld season, and the two Calloways closed the arm's length and held on in the green wash of the lens with the last ramp of the ladder lift behind them, and the crowd looked away, most of them, because some arithmetic is private. Iddy Moore did not look away. Iddy was 7, and stood watching with her vents wide open, learning. Sephan could see it happen. What the lever she had thrown every dusk had actually been attached to. Much later, wagons gone, the last load fed and bedded, the field quiet for the first time in 30 hours. Sephan sat against the pump house wall in the small cold hours with a lamp and a heel of mill bread he was too tired to eat, and the two Calloway women sat on the cell crate under the pylon with one blanket across the both of them, and he heard, because Tellusk hear everything and are too polite to mention it, the conversation that the bronze plaque never got. "They told you we were dead." Etta's voice, flat, no question in it, officially, with a finding. "And the colony believed the finding. It was good arithmetic, Gran. 11 years is 11 years. They voted my land off me the night before you came. You beat the seizure by 7 hours." A pause. "They're feeding 3,000 people tonight in every barn in the valley, so I'm not minded to keep score." "I am," said Etta Calloway, in the tone of a flight chief, and let it go. Fabric shifted. The old woman's head tipped back. Sephan could picture, without looking, the pale eyes going up the pylon to the burning ring of glass. "You know I half lied to you, Bird, in that message. Field and light on the old corridor. I knew the colony dropped the field obligation the year the relays started failing. The renunciation went out on the last working segment. The factors copied every lift group for liability's sake. Hewell told us, in writing, that there would be no field." Sephan went very still against the pump house wall. "I knew it. The flight deck knew it. 11 years I made them keep the optics standard anyway, and ran us at a corridor with a written no at the end of it. And you want to know my arithmetic? I had a crate in your mother's freight, shipped the year you were born, and I had you in a kitchen with a receiver, growing up on 14 seconds of my voice. That was the whole sum. A lens and a girl, 2 items. Her hand, knuckled with age, came out of the blanket and rested on the gray wood. Every official channel in 2 systems wrote us off, and they were working from full information, and they were right by every page of it. The only thing they weren't holding was the manifest of one freight crate and the temperament of one Callaway. Nobody audits for that. There's no column for it. There should be, Wren said. There can't be, her grandmother said, comfortably. That's the point of it. If you could put it in a column, they'd have priced it and leaned it and seized it noon tomorrow with the rest. Stefan heard the smile arrive in the old voice. The chip? You never asked in your letters. Did you work it out? I assumed shipping damage. Then I assumed you'd tell me when you came. A beat, and then with care, like a wager being placed, you came. Runway 9, Etta said. The night before demolition. The wreckers had the whole approach line scheduled for the crusher at dawn. 40 years that light brought people home over the seawall, and it was booked to die as aggregate. I went over the fence at low tide with a pry bar and 2 friends whose names I'll give you when certain statutes expire. The old woman laughed, a dry rattle with surprising distance in it. We had the housing half off when the watchman's lamp came down the line, no time to be gentle. I set the bar wrong, levered short, and the outer ring kissed the seawall stone going into the sling. I heard it chip. I felt it in my teeth. 40 years of homecomings, and I'd bitten it, stealing it. Her hand moved on the wood. I cried about it on the train, and an old man across the aisle asked me what I'd lost, and I said nothing. I'd saved it. And he looked at the crate and the bar and said, I have never forgotten it. Then the chips the price tag misses. Whole things belong to whoever bought them. Chipped things belong to whoever carried them out. The blanket shifted again. So when they tell you it's pre-collapsed glass worth $9,000 to a collector, you tell them the truth, bird. The glass is worth $9,000. The chip is the part that can't be bought, because the chip is the proof it was carried. Down the field, the lens burned over all 3 of them, and the next thing Stefan knew, his lamp was guttering, and the sky was paling at the rim, and the elder Callaway was prodding him awake with her boot. Not unkindly, the way you'd check whether a fence was load-bearing. You're the neighbor, she said when his dust lids cleared. The drawl boy. The one who hauled stone all year for a field his own house voted to seize. It was not a question. Quill's debrief had evidently been thorough. The pale eyes measured him with no allowance made for his being twice her size. She tells me you don't believe in the corridor, that you did the whole of it on arithmetic that never came out for a neighbor you decided was sun-touched. That's so, Stefan said, because under those eyes nothing else would have survived the trip. Etta Callaway nodded slowly, like a chief signing off an inspection. 11 years I flew with a deck full of believers, she said, and the believers were a comfort, and on the bad shifts the believers wobbled, every time, because belief argues with the dark. You know what doesn't wobble? She tapped his arm twice with one finger hard as a latch closing. A being who shows up with no reason at all but that somebody had to. That's the strongest material in this universe, boy. They don't make hulls out of it because it can't be quoted at tender. She gathered the blanket off the crate and looked once more up the pylon and once down the kilometer of strip going silver in the dawn and delivered the only judgment on the field that Stefan ever heard her give. Short, she said. Good crown, mind. But if my granddaughter means to keep a waypoint, she'll want 1,500 meters in a second light. The lift had 9 groups, and the other 8 are still out there, slow on dead transmitters, looking at the same survey. She started up the strip toward the kitchens at a flight chief's walk. Best get the bunting up. By that morning, the second morning, the count was done, and the count was this. 2,981 souls off the Yarrow group, plus the ferry crews on their last rotation, made 3,006 human beings, alive, fed, and sleeping under crossfin roofs, in a colony of 1,900 that had voted 30 hours earlier to seize the ground they'd landed on. The depot scale house, which had taken book on the strip for a season, spent the day weighing flour wagons free of charge with the slate-turned face to the wall, until the younger Vanek of all beings turned it back around, chalked the old 500 to 1 line at the top, wrote paid in full. Highmore across it in letters the width of his hand, and nailed the slate above the scale house door, where it hangs to this day behind glass that the depot polishes and will not sell. 3006. Stefan walked the valley road at noon to carry his mother's billet tables to the mill, and counted as he went, the Tellusk habit, helpless. Every barn full, every kitchen lit, 41 lift children asleep in the colony hall, 1,100 strangers' bowls drying on racks in the market square. And at the bottom of the bottomland, small as a struck match at that distance, the green point of the lens, still burning in broad day over the field that had caught them all, because the keeper of Hewell Field did not consider a corridor closed, while 8 groups of the ladder lift were still slow in the dark and looking for the standard. The valley had laughed at 1 light for a year. By the next equinox there were 2, the second tower raised at the strip's far end by Colony Labor and Colony Credit, with Peladuba directing the Por and Rukatarn, of all hands, on the winch line. And on the night the second light first came on, green answering green down 1.5 kilometers of new packed ground, the longest made thing on the world, there was bunting. The board met at quarter day, as boards do, and Voradrol's motion ran exactly as drafted and carried exactly as promised. 13-0. Every hand up in the beam light, including Rukatarn's raised first, held highest, in front of the same packed benches, the elder Vanex. The resumption was vacated, the parcel went back whole. The field was chartered as colony infrastructure, the Callaway holding endowed as keeper's land in perpetuity, and the keeper's stipend set at a figure that made Wren's mouth go flat until Bex, from the lienholder's seat, observed mildly that the colony had spent 20 years not paying for a field and could consider the arrears a bargain at the price. The hall laughed at that. At itself, the first time in anyone's memory, and the laugh was worth more than the stipend. What could not be voted back was voted around. The morning after quarter day, 3 North Valley growers' wagons came down the Depoteau Road unannounced and unloaded, onto the Callaway porch, the vacuum casks of 5 years of select silkweed seed, the whole line, bought back from themselves at their own cost, not one cask missing. The eldest grower, a stooped human named Aldous Weather, who had cursed the plowing as apostasy to anyone who'd listen, would accept neither payment nor thanks, and left only a sentence, delivered to the porch post since he could not deliver it to her face. A line that good shouldn't end on being right. It was the closest the North Valley ever came to an apology, and it was close enough. The seed needed ground, and the keeper of a working airfield had none to spare. It was Essex Drawl who solved it, at his own table, by sliding the freehold map of the Drawl bottom field across the bread to his middle son with beekeeper's economy. You'll want this then. And so the Callaway silkery line went back into soil the next thaw on Drawl land, under a Drawl roof's care, with Wren walking the rows twice a season as advisor and refusing to call it hers. And the boundary fence between the two? Holdings, the fence Krell had hammered, the fence the valley had screamed over, got a gate cut into it that first winter, wide enough for a hauler, hung by the smith's apprentice with hinges she forged heavy enough, she said, to outlast every opinion anyone had ever held on either side of it. Nobody in either house ever again closed it except against weather. The wider world arrived in stages, the way it always does, late and loud and claiming it had believed all along. The smelter's traffic office sent a formal commendation for exemplary maintenance of a private navigational aid, which Wren pinned inside the pump house door at exactly the height where visitors using the facilities could reflect on the word private. The factor's finding was quietly superseded. 11 years of terminal drift revised, in 3 bloodless lines to extended silent transit, and no one ever stood in any hall anywhere to answer for the difference. Peladuva read those 3 lines once at the depot counter and handed the page back to the operator and said, "Mind they build themselves for the bunting." And that was the entire obituary the finding received in the Brace Valley, and more than it deserved. But the corridors woke everywhere. That was the part Sefin had never run in any of his sleepless arithmetic. That one light, kept, would be contagious. The lift had 9 groups, and the 8 still out there were slow, dark-bound, steering on a generation-old survey toward waypoints that had everyone taken the same discount and dropped the same obligation. Huel had been no one's exception, it had been the rule. And now there came, on the trade spine's own channels, the strangest traffic of the age. Colony after waypoint colony. Sister Worlds Crossfin knew only as names on freight manifests, asking, quietly at first, then in open tender, for survey reconstruction, for grading specifications, for the optical standard of a pre-collapse approach lens. Asha Quill spent half that first year on the long band as the only living approach authority in 2 systems, talking distant magistrates through threshold markings with the weary patience of a woman who had heard the words, "But is it really worth the expense?" from inside a falling ferry. 6 fields stood finished within 2 years, on 6 worlds, under 6 lights tuned to the standard. The beings who built them all said the same thing, in the same slightly defensive tone to their own fence lines. Probably for nothing. Probably no one's coming. They had learned the first half of it from Huel, Sefin thought. The second half each valley had to learn for itself. That probably was not a load-bearing word, and never had been, that every official channel in existence could write a thing off with full information and clean pages, and the universe would still occasionally side with one stubborn pair of hands holding a light against the whole of the visible evidence. The survivors stayed, mostly. That had been the board's worry in the first exhausted week. 1,900 colonists, 3,000 guests, 1 harvest lost to weather and another to conviction, and it lasted precisely until the valley discovered what it had actually been handed, which was not 3,000 mouths but 3,000 pairs of the hardest tested hands in human history. Beings who had kept 2 arcs alive for 11 dark years on triage and tape did not require instruction in scarcity. By the first full summer, there were lift engineers in the mill and the smithy, lift medics in the surgery, lift agronomists arguing fertilizer doctrine with North Valley growers in 2 accents of the same dead language. The housing terraces went up the south slope in 18 months, timber and pale stone, and Crossfin became, in the space of 2 seasons, the second town of the whole world with its own name on the spine charts. Huel Field, POP, 5100, all-weather strip, license waypoint, approach light maintained. 41 lift children learned to swim in the mill pond. Iddy Moore taught most of them, having appointed herself to it, as she appointed herself to everything connected with the field. The depot operator retired and Quill took the traffic desk. The second tower wanted a keeper's apprentice, and there was never any question whose name went on that, though she had to grow 4 more years before the board would write it. Old passengers of the original boarding sat on the new terraces in the long evenings watching weather come down the brace, real rain, falling rain, and would not go indoors for it, ever, and the valley learned to leave them be and to leave a chair out. Mock came around the way Mock came around to anything, sideways, claiming the position had been his from the start. He worked the terrace builds. He was first to stand a lift engineer ajar at the depot, and at midwinter at the full family table, restored. Both sons, no subject forbidden. He announced to the company that he personally had always said the strip would be the making of the valley, and waited, vents wide daring anyone, the table let him have it. His father's eyes found Seffin's over the honey jar, and one slate eyelid came down and went up again slow, and that was the drawl house's last word on the year of the field. His mother never did speak of the abstention. But the following spring, when the colony's new intake of board apprentices stood in the hall to recite the charter, Vora Drawl, presiding, added one sentence to the oath that had not been in it before and has not come out of it since, and every clerk and every magistrate sworn on Huel, since that day has had to say it aloud in front of the bunting before touching a single column of the colony's figures. Arithmetic is never wrong, and is never the whole field. It was a year and a season after the Yarrow landings, high summer, the silky coming back gold on the drawl side of the gate. The strip's second extension, fresh packed to Edda's, demanded 1,500 meters. That the corridor band woke for the 3rd time in Seffin Drawl's life. He was at the threshold when it happened, as it happened, half the valley was. It was the eve of the field's chartering anniversary, and there were tables out on the apron, lamps strung tower to tower, 3,000 and some new neighbors and 1,900 old ones eating off boards laid across feed barrels, and Edda Calloway holding court at the pylon's foot with a mug of mill beer and a circle of children whom she was teaching, with complete disregard for parental anxiety, the correct way to lever a lens housing off a condemned light in the dark. The receiver up at the house did what it had done for 2 years in a season. It muttered. And then it didn't. Seffin knew before he knew. He was Telesk. The change in a sound reached him the way ground reaches feet, and his head came up out of the conversation a full second before the speaker wired to the tower. Quill's innovation. The band piped lived to the field, because the keeper of Huel Field would have it nowhere else. Cleared its throat of static and said, in a voice nobody on that apron had ever heard, ragged, harrowed, disbelieving its own luck, Huel Station, Huel Station. Belwart Group, Ferry Flight Belwart 1, inbound the old corridor on survey and visual. We have a green light, repeat, we are looking at a green light? Query is the light real? Souls aboard 2,214. We've been Dark 9, the voice cracked clean through, and came back, 19 years, Huel, if the green is real, say so plain. The apron did not erupt. That was the thing Seffin carried hardest out of that night, the proof of how far the valley had come from the fence line where it had screamed at a plow. 5,000 beings went silent all at once, complete, and turned to the pylon. And then everything happened that was supposed to happen, smooth as a gate on forged hinges, because this time the whole colony was the instrument. Quill was at the tower mast before the transmission ended. Pell's successor crews were clearing the strip of tables in long-practiced halls. The kitchens, without one order spoken, swung from feast to receiving. Vora Drawl stood up at the head table and began assigning barns off the top of her head by name, in order of roof condition. The colony of Crossfin took the weight the way packed ground takes a skid, built for it, finally, all the way down. And at the foot of the pylon, in the middle of the only stillness on the field, Wren Calloway set down her cup and looked up at the lens, at the old green ring burning its 400 and some thousandth hour over the valley that had once voted her mad. Seffin, who was watching her face as he had watched it across a fence, a storm, a vote, a year, saw it hold perfectly steady as she took the handset Quill threw to her. The steadiness of 2 generations, the family issue, no cure, none wanted. Belwarn Hewelfield, she said. Plain, the way her grandmother had taught the whole dark to listen. The green is real. The green is for you. It's been lit every night for 2 years waiting on your group, and there's supper out on the apron. So mind your skids. You're our second landing, not our first. Hewell keeps the corridor. A breath, and then she said the rest of it, the part that was never in any procedure, while her grandmother rose to her feet at the pylon's foot and 5,000 beings stood quiet around the long green line of the strip. You were never lost, Belwart. You were slow. There's a difference, and this valley knows it now. Come down. They watched the first retro flare open over the eastern rim together, the whole field, nobody breathing, and then the apron crews ran for the flag lines, and the night went to work. Sefin stood at the boundary gate a moment before joining them, one hand on the smith's hinges, looking back down the 1.5 kilometers of light. At the fence where a year of screaming had started, at the gold of his neighbor's returned silkery, standing deep on his family's side of a fence that no longer divided anything. At the pylon, where a small chipped ring of glass, carried over a seawall at low tide by a woman the official record had buried twice, burned green. Against the falling dark, holding the line it had always held. Over the field nobody believed in, saying the thing it had said every single night to everyone, which had never changed, which never would, and which the whole world now finally read fluently. I am still expecting them. Out of the east, slow but not lost, the sky answered it again.